Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Aesir and today I'm going to talk about Vanatru. Surprisingly, this was one of the most asked videos this year, and here we are finally. I think October is a perfectly good month to talk about Vanatru. Now, here's the thing. Vanatru is a neo-pagan branch within heathenry following certain perceptions of Germanic paganism. So in this video, I'm not going to explore an ancient religion, obviously. I'm going to make a study on one contemporary pagan religion. And you will understand what I'm saying further ahead. So, let's get started. First things first, to understand why Vanatru came to be, we must understand Asatru. I've already done a video about it, but I think some quick notes are needed, necessary. Asatru is the term created by the followers of the Nordic neo-pagan religion during the 19th century to designate the modern construction of the religious traditions of Scandinavia before the introduction of Christianity. The name, roughly translated to its contemporary meaning, means to be true to the Aesir, one of the tribes of the Norse gods depicted in Norse mythology. Although I must reinforce that this is the common designation and that the origins of the name might come from the Old Norse word Hals, plural Aesir, meaning the principal pantheon in Norse religion or gods in general, and from Trú, meaning faith, the faith of the Aesir. Therefore, during the 19th century, Asatru meant to be true to the Norse gods in general, to be faithful and worship the Norse gods. But with the increasing knowledge about pre-Christian Scandinavian pagan traditions, and obviously with the creation of other branches of this pagan faith, Asatru also became the term to refer to a religion much more focused on the Aesir tribe of gods. As Asatru increasingly became more detached from what it was originally, and started to be much more focused on just a couple of aspects of the ancient Germanic religious conceptions, many people felt the need to develop other neo-pagan branches of Old Norse religion. Asatru is not an ancient religion, but a contemporary creation of Old Norse religion. Creation, not reconstruction. Because of this aspect, much of Asatru actually has a lot of parallels with non-pagan religions. The phenomenon of contemporary neo-paganism is exactly this, not reconstructions of old pagan religions, but new religious creations that were adapted to the religious and political panorama of the 19th century. Please watch my video about tribal heathenry and you will understand the differences between neo-pagan creations and heathen reconstructionisms. So, because Asatru focused too much on just a tiny fraction of actual Old Norse religious perceptions, many aspects of the old faith were put aside or simply forgotten. So the first neo-pagan branch from Asatru was Vanatru, for those who were more inclined to the worship of the Vanir tribe of gods in opposition to those who worshipped the Aesir tribe of gods. Vanatru starts off precisely as a counter-neo-paganism in opposition to the ideas expressed in Asatru. So now let's try to understand what Vanatru is. Vanatru focuses on the worship of the Vanir tribe of gods. Vanatru is the term that came to be used in the early 90s of the past century to designate those whose religious practices were much more turned to the Vanir tribe of gods such as Freyr, Freyja and Njord. These are the three main gods within Vanatru. Obviously, I'm not here to speak on behalf of those who identify themselves as being followers or practitioners of Vanatru. I'm here to give you a quick and general panorama because within Vanatru itself, many take things differently and their approach to the divine is certainly different from place to place accordingly to their own spiritual paths. Vanatru comes as an expression of faith towards the Old Norse deities to make a separation on the worship of such deities, because when Germanic neo-paganisms started to appear, all gods were treated in the same manner, and the worship and rituals were somewhat blended, and the religious approach was the same. Because everything was treated in the same way, this led people to put aside certain deities and focus much more on other deities, since everything was seen as practically the same. So Vanatru comes to express a certain individuality in the worship of the Old Norse gods, to acknowledge the Vanir as indeed a different pantheon with its own rituals, ceremonies, cults, religious approach in general, that couldn't possibly be mixed with the other gods, since the Vanir tribe of gods represent a totally different aspect of life and the perception of life itself and how we interact with it. Vanatru, it's almost a spirituality that came to give a certain opposition to Asatru, because Asatru began as a faith that tried to focus on all the gods, but as it developed throughout the 20th century, it became much more focused on perspectives of social order and social activities, much more concerned with the community and the needs of a society. So much more focused on the Aesir as the main tribe of Norse deities that represent such social aspects. So, in contrast, Vanatru came to focus the Old Norse spirituality in other realities, much more concerned with fertility aspects of life, magic, ritual, in other words, much more focused on Nordic witchcraft. Vanatru is an attempt to get closer to the true sense of the word paganism, as in classical Latin, paganos, rural and rustic, those from the rural areas, the countryside, who kept the old faiths. So Vanatru is a much more nature-oriented spirituality without the organized religious structure of Asatru. Obviously, this doesn't mean that Asatru isn't also nature-oriented in certain aspects. What we have to understand is that we have come to a point in which Asatru is a branch of Nordic paganism, and Asatru itself already has ramifications, and within Asatru there are certain groups that conduct things differently. Some prefer to be more nature-oriented, others prefer to focus on more philosophical and scientific aspects, while others focus much more on the myths and so on. So, just in a short sentence, I think it's safe to say about the main differences between Asatru and Vanatru that the Aesir are the gods of civilization, as in within the confinements of the matters of the civilized world, and the Vanir are the gods of nature outside the confinement of civilization and our interaction with the natural world. Asatru is centered on the community, while Vanatru is centered on nature and the natural surroundings where the community exists. Within Vanatru, working with each deity, expression of faith towards a particular deity is different from god to god. Each deity has its own rites and spiritual approach or spiritual work, as opposed to treating the divine as being all the same, doing the same ceremonies and giving the same offerings as it is done within Asatru. Witchcraft is more carefully treated, and it is a huge part of the expression of faith within Vanatru. Because indeed, the Vanir gods, especially Freya, is the Norse goddess regarded as being the goddess of Seidr, and passed on Seidr to Odin and subsequently to the other gods. Witchcraft as in the pure sense of folk magic. You see, if we solely focus on the literary sources, you will notice that almost all of them, the great majority, are always in the perspective of the Aesir tribe of gods. Because in truth, when the written sources were composed, were already in a time culturally far from the pagan past. Works composed by Icelandic Christians with little contact with the countryside of their continental cousins. So, much of the actual old religious practices and folk magic do not come in the literary works, simply because much has been forgotten by the time the literary sources were put to parchment. So obviously the Vanir tribe of gods were simply included as Aesir, and there wasn't a great effort to explore the Vanir as a distinct group of gods. The main idea passed on to us was that the Vanir were simply the fertility gods of the Norse pantheon, precisely because such gods and their worship were still kept by the people of the countryside, the pagans, the people who were geographically and culturally far from those who composed the literary works in the 13th century, during the Catholic period. But if we take a look at the archaeological record, folklore, folk traditions, legends, even superstition, we come to the conclusion that the Vanir gods and their cults were extended to a variety of realities, not just fertility. The cult of the dead, for instance. There are many indications that it's linked to Freya. Divination was linked to Freyr. The exploration of food resources, such as agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering, were linked to Vanir deities. Aesir as well, and the cult of the ancestors, the land spirits, wights, elves, and so on, are part of the religious panorama linked to the Vanir gods. There's plenty to work with. Again, the Vanir are the gods of the innumerable realities outside the urban centers, outside the civilized world. Vana Trú is a heathen spiritual practice centered on the Vanir and the various realities of their cults. The differences between devotion to the Vanir and to the Aesir in ancient times are derived from different social levels. The Vanir are the gods of the farming populations whose reality kept them far from urban centers, and therefore they kept older forms of faith, and the Aesir were the gods of the warlike lords, nobility in general, and their followers living closer to the centers of power, therefore in a closer contact with the faith and gods of lords and kings. But who exactly are the Vanir? The Vanir are the second tribe or family of gods of the Old Norse faith. Mainly this family is composed by three deities, Freyr, Freya and Njord. I know a lot of people like to include in the Vanir all sorts of gods that apparently have no family or don't belong to an apparent group, but the Vanir in truth are restricted to these three main deities. It's a common mistake to perceive the Norse pantheon as just two tribes, as if any other gods that aren't immediately perceived as belonging to the Aesir, well, then people automatically shove them or place them within the Vanir tribe of gods. This is a very common mistake, obviously due to the literary sources composed in a time already culturally detached from the pagan past. In the prehistoric origins of the Germanic gods, there wasn't a hierarchical organization of the Germanic pantheon yet. There were many groups of gods, each with its own field of expertise, so to speak. The Vanir happened to be the group of gods who presided over peace and prosperity, fertility and magic, as well as linked to the cult of the dead. Now, devotion to the Vanir can be traced far back. The god, goddess, Nerthos, etymologically identical to Njord, was mentioned as early as Tacitus, and the fertility gods who appear on Bronze Age rock carvings, without a doubt, should be seen as representing Vanir deities. Perhaps not all of them, certainly, but quite a few, if we take into consideration that in Scandinavia there are far more place names based on names of the Vanir gods than any of all the other gods put together, with the exception of Huldr, of course. There are plenty of place names derived from Huldr, who wasn't a Vanir god, but belonging to another group of gods, certainly with links to both the Vanir and the Aesir, but a completely different cult. But here's the thing they don't teach you at fancy law school. The god Hing was a specific god linked to the Vanir cult. Hing, who later on in Scandinavia became one with the god Freyr, should definitely be added to the list of the Vanir. But on the god Hing and Freyr for another time. But with certainty, we can say that Njord, Freyr and Freyja are from the Vanir. The deities known as the Vanir are not easy to define in the northern myths because of the many divine or semi-divine figures who emerge at different points and with very complex relationships to one another. In some way, the deities of the Vanir are the closest of all the heathen deities to mankind. The Vanir were not the gods that expressed notions of good and evil or right and wrong, and they did not express ideals of justice and good conduct as the Aesir do. The Vanir were the gods that in all essence transmitted the power to create new life, and such powers were directed to the fertility of all life and the growing and evolution of life itself within the house, the farm and the natural world. The Vanir are the gods that bring the power to mankind to create a link between the supernatural, the unseen world, as it is expressed in various methods of divination within their cult, including Seidra itself. The Vanir bring the gift of life, the pure joy of experiencing life as it is, without restrictions imposed by a specific conduct, laws, rules and other social organisms that simply have no power over the essence of nature. Later on, I think I shall develop a video precisely about the power of the Vanir, because I think it will be necessary to speak about the incest aspects of the Vanir as well as orgies. Not that this is done today, of course. Well, perhaps orgies, yes, thank the gods. But there are many aspects within the Vanir cult that haven't been quite explored and have been highly misinterpreted. But that is for another time. This video today is just to give you quick notions of what Vanatru is. So within Vanatru, the three gods that get more attention are Njord, Freyr and Freyja. Not that there aren't other gods which can be perceived as being Vanir or somehow also have a connection with the Vanir, but the evidences are too few, simply not enough to clearly state which other gods belong to the Vanir cult. Some like to include Hulr in the Vanir cult. Hulr, it seems, was a god of great importance in Scandinavia once, judging by the great amount of place names. Places called after Hulr are, in many cases, near those called after Freyr, Freyja and Njord, and Njord's wife, Skadi, who became Hulr's wife. So indeed, it's natural to assume that he was once associated with the Vanir. But Hulr remains a mysterious and shadowy figure, and is a good reminder of the many northern deities and cults which have simply faded into oblivion. The belief that the god Hulr was also one of the Vanir, in all honesty, can hardly be proven. This goes to deities such as Skadi, Scyld, Birgir and the goddess Gifjon and such. Some may originally have been heroes who in the course of time were promoted to divinity. Some may have been imported into the north from foreign sources, and some may have begun as abstractions used by poets that have gradually developed a literary personality of their own. There are many gods that we simply know nothing about, and because they aren't immediately perceived as belonging to a specific pantheon, people automatically bring them into the Vanir because of the wrong perception that the original pantheon of Norse deities were just divided into two groups. The gods were far more complex than that. Take Loki, for instance. He doesn't belong to any group specifically. Or Bragi. He just wanders about and he is loved by all. He is even welcomed by the enemies of both the Aesir and the Vanir. So there is this wrong tendency to place all sorts of deities of the Norse pantheon that are not Aesir into the Vanir tribe of gods, as if the Vanir tribe of gods was the place for downtrodden gods. So, you will certainly hear people who are practitioners of or followers of Vanatru tell you about all sorts of gods being Vanir, as if they were in some sort of competition to have a larger number of gods than the ones existing in the Aesir group of gods. Yes, to some people it's clearly a competition, and then you have terrible mistakes as bringing Gulveige into the Vanir tribe of gods. The personification of primordial darkness and chaos and the very essence of cosmic destruction has no place in the Vanir tribe of gods. I understand to a certain extent why people try to bring Gulveige into the Vanir, because of the Vanir connection with magic. But the Vanir are connected to Seidr, to divination, to healing, fertility. Gulveige is the true essence of transformative magic through the obliteration of matter. Within sorcery, there are many different fields, and our ancestors were well aware of that. Just because magic is linked to the Vanir doesn't mean it's every kind of magic. The Vanir are linked to Seidr, to the figure of the vulva. Seidr was essentially a divination ceremony, and sometimes used for hostile purposes to affect someone's mind. But all in all, with certainty, the true Vanir gods are indeed Njordr, Freyr and Freya. They better express precisely the various cults linked to the Vanir, as we find in the sources and in the archaeological record. Njordr, Freyr and Freya are the embodiment of what the Vanir tribe of gods truly represent. As mentioned before, peace, prosperity, plenty, fertility, the power to link with the unseen through divination, and the laws of nature out of human control. The Vanir are indeed the gods of all things outside the community that people need to survive and be alive. Not the gods of chaotic and destructive aspects of nature, not the embodiment of celestial bodies, not the personification of the wild side of nature, but the embodiment of the natural world outside the community that mankind needs to be alive. The Vanir are the personification of the gift of life, because if crops fail, if children die, if there is no fertility, healing, rejuvenation, the communities are doomed and without hope. And of course, without a touch with the mysterious and the unseen, we do not quite understand our place in all of this. Without magic and sense of mystery, we are simply frigid and listless beings, just a shell, an empty husk. Magic gives us enthusiasm to appreciate the gift of life, because life itself is magical. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Later on I shall develop more on the Vanir deities, on their qualities, attributes and the true gift of the Vanir. This video was just an introduction to what Vanatru is, so you can have a quick idea of the general panorama. If you enjoyed this video, please do share it with your friends and your enemies and, well, every other person or troll. If you haven't subscribed yet and plan on doing it, when you do, or if you do it, please click on the bell icon so you can get all the notifications of what goes on in this channel and you won't miss a thing. And if you want to contribute in some way so I can continue to, well, provide content, you can always become my patron and have exclusive access to a variety of things, including behind the scenes and my essays and academic works and other useful information concerning the content of my videos. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Enjoy the rest of October, and as always, tack för idag. My dear friends, I have to apologize for having to cut this video over and over again, but it's impressive. Every 3 minutes an airplane passes by. I thought this was a safe haven, but it's just maddening, the noise. I don't know if you had that perception, but Everything trembles in here. It will be a miracle if I can get anything useful out of this work. Always these metal birds coming to disrupt the peace. Nordic neo-pagan religion. Holy shit. Bloody hell. And Asatru itself fucking hell, mate. The Vanir gods. There's plenty to work with. What the hell is this? Seriously, what the hell is this place? I thought this was a haven. It's fucking terrible. Such a loud noise. I don't think you have the perception of everything trembles in here. Now, here comes a god. Here comes another airplane. Ideals of justice and good conduct. God damn. Not that this is done today. The destroyer. It will be a miracle if I can get any decent work out of this. By the gods. Killing the boat of that. Take this. It's just this tiny phrase. Leave me alone, you metal birds.